guys, welcome back. So what we are looking at today is lesson 1.6, look for a pattern. So we're going to be looking at patterns and dealing with decimals while we're looking at these patterns. So what we have here, I know it might look really confusing, hopefully you guys can see it okay, is a decimal chart. So we have all these decimals wrote out, and what we want to do is determine what the pattern is within here and then finish writing out those squares. So what it says here is there are patterns in decimal number charts. Continue the pattern to label the other squares. So what we're going to take and do is look as we go from one column to the next. So remember, columns are our vertical parts, rows are horizontal. So as we look at our columns, how we go from one column to the next, what's the change? What happens? How do we get from that first number of 100th to the next number of 200ths? What changed? How did we get from 100th to 200ths? We went up by a 100th, exactly. So we're going up, so we're adding, hopefully you can see this. Kind of faint, hang on. Let me make that a little better. Okay, now I'll use black marker. That way you guys can see it. I want to make it as easy as possible to see. So, like I said, we're going up by 100th. So that 0.01, and there's a decimal point in there. It's a little hard to see. So, that's what we do to get from 100th to 200ths. Well, what do we do to get from 200ths to 300ths? The same thing, exactly. So we're going up by another 100. So here we have 300ths, we're going up, but what happened? It's blank. So based on what we see here, what do we think the pattern is? What should go in this box here? Yeah, 400ths. So we went from 300ths to 400ths. Now let's look at the next. So we had our 400ths that we said it needed to be. So what should it be to get to the next column? We're going to go up another 100th, exactly. So, one more than 400ths is 500ths. All right, what about the next one? What should the next one be? Based on this pattern of adding a 100th. 600ths. Excellent. What about the next one? 700ths. Next one's given to us. Did it work out? Did what we think our pattern was actually work to where we have that next value? Well, we went from 700ths to 800ths. That went up by 100ths. So it did end up working. So we found the right pattern. So then after 800ths would be 900ths. And then 900ths to, now technically it would be 1000ths, but we can write 1000ths as 1/10. It's the exact same thing. So that's why we have just the 0.1. I don't know why I froze. Ooh, sorry. All right, so we figured out what this looks like based on the rows. So as we move to the right, oops, that's not W, sorry. As we move to the right in the rows, we add 100. So that's the first, oops, sorry, walked out of the screen. That's the first part of our pattern, is that's what we do with the rows. As we go across, we're adding 100th to this. Now, The adding 100th is unique to what the numbers are here. If we would have just had 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, so 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, we wouldn't be adding 100th. Well, yeah, okay, cancel that. We would be adding 100. Because as we go up, it's not just going to look like that. We're always going to be adding the 100th as we go to the right in the rows. So keep that in mind. Now, this first column, well, what do we notice? We only have that first value of 100. That's not very helpful. Second column, though, we started with just 200ths. There's 2 blanks in between, and then we ended up at 3200ths. What are you supposed to happen going from 200ths to get all the way down to 3200ths? And it might help to look over here where we have them right next to each other. So we went from 500ths to 1500ths. What changed here? What did we add by? We added by a 10th. So instead of adding by 100th, we're adding by an entire 10th. So, whoops, dropped my width. Okay. So plus 0.1. I know that's kind of hard to see, but it says plus 0.1 or 1/10. So our second one, as we move down the columns, we add one, oops, trying to write the wrong thing. We add 1/10. So I wrote that out as the numerical, the standard version rather than the word version like I did on the previous one, but you guys get the idea. So that means if here we went from 500ths to 1500ths, if we go down one more, if we add another 10th to that, instead of 1500ths, we're going to have, what's 15 plus 10 essentially? Yeah, 25. So now we're at 25 hundredths. So what should this last row be? 35 hundredths. Now, does that 35 hundredths work with the 34 hundredths just ahead of it in the row? Yes, it does, because it's in the 30s, but it's 1/100th less than the 35, which is right because we're going to the left in this row. And we said our pattern was, as we move to the right in the rows, we add 100th. So as we're moving to the right, that means this would be 36 hundredths, which works because then we get 37 hundredths. Alright, so now we need to take and fill out the rest of this. So go ahead and pause the video for a second and take and fill this out in your own notes. This is a good thing to have down in your notes. It can help you as you go through this because, like I said, this is the pattern you're going to see in these decimal charts. So pause the video for a second and then we'll take and I will continue to fill these out and then you can check your work. So feel free to pause. Alright, so the first one, hopefully you guys paused and wrote these out for yourselves. So this first one here, as we move down in the column, instead of being at 1/100th, we're now at 1100ths. So going down another one, we're going to be at 2100ths because we're adding a 10th each time. So the next one down will be 3100ths. So we go to our next column. We have 200ths. We add a 10th to that, so we end up with 1200ths. We add another 10th to that, and we end up with 2200ths. And our last row is 3200ths, which is accurate. So this next one here, we should have 1300ths, then 2300ths, and then 3300ths. So depending on how you did this on your own, you may have just worked all the way across and added 100th each time, or you may have done it vertically, or you may have gotten yourself started vertically within the column and then worked your way across. Either way is perfectly fine. It's whatever makes most sense to you, and as long as you're getting the numbers in the right places, then you're good to go. Alright, so this one here, under the 400ths will be 1400ths, and then 2400ths, and then the 3400ths that's already there. We already did the 5s column, so let's look at the 6s. We've got 600ths, 1600ths, so the next one will be 2600ths. And then the last one that's already there, 3600ths. Alright, 700ths. So we add a tenth, we get 1700ths. Add another tenth, we get 2700ths. Next column, we have the 800ths. So we add we add a tenth, we get 1800ths. And we add another tenth, we get 2800ths. And we add another tenth, and we get 3800ths. Alright, just 2 more columns left. So our 900ths column is fairly well filled out, so what we left off with is the 2900ths. So we add a tenth to that, and we end up with 3900ths. Alright, the last column. So the last column looks a little different because instead of writing 10 hundredths, we just wrote 1/10. So we're going to do the same thing on the others. So if we're going from 19 and we're going up a hundredth, we're going to be at 20. But instead of writing 20 hundredths, we're going to write 2 tenths. Same thing for the next one, because remember, as we go down the column, we're just adding a tenth. So if we have 1/10, then 2 tenths, then we're going to be at 3 tenths for the third row. And the last row, if we add another tenth to our 3 tenths, we'll be at 4 tenths. So, like I said, this right here, these are important. The patterns, knowing how we're taking and changing between each number in the row as well as each number in the column. So remember, as we go through the row, we're going up by 1/100th. As we go down in the column, we're going up by 1/10. Okay? Alright, so we've got a few examples to run through. See if I can get this so you can see it. Okay, so what are the missing decimals? So we've got a single column here and we've got a single row over here. So here we started off with 1/100th. How do we take and go down a column? Do we add a hundredth or do we add a tenth? Remember? Whoops. As we move down the columns, we add a tenth. So we have 1/100th. We're going to add a tenth to it, so we're going to end up with 11/100ths. Remember, plus. So then we do it again. So 11/100ths plus a tenth gives us 21/100ths. And then we do it one last time. And 21/100ths plus a tenth gives us 31/100ths. Excellent. So remember these patterns. Make sure you have these 2 things in your notes. And yes, you should be taking notes on this so you have it. So that includes both remote learners and our hybrid learners. So make sure you're all taking notes, okay? They'll be very important to you. All right, the next one. Now, we did the column, now we're doing the row. So what's the rule that we have to do when we do a row? Do we add a tenth or do we add a hundredth? We add a hundredth, correct. So here, we don't have our starting number. We started off almost at the very end. Maybe I'm going to, okay. I don't know why. My screen keeps freezing. I don't know if I freeze for you guys, but my screen keeps freezing as I'm recording, so that's why I keep kind of waving at you, just so you know. Okay, so like I was saying, we have this number way over here. We don't have the numbers before it, but we know based on the rule that as we move to the right, we're going to increase by 1/100th. So what's going to happen if we start at the right and we work to the left? Are we still going to increase by 100th? No, we're going to decrease by 100. So if we start at 29 hundredths, what should be in this box here? 28 hundredths. It's one less. So when going this direction, we subtract 100th. So we're subtracting 100th as we go to the left. So going to the left again, what should be in front of 28 hundredths? 27 hundredths. So once again, we subtracted our 100th. And the first box then should be 26 hundredths. So be super careful and always remember that if we go to the left, you have to subtract. If you go to the right, you're going to add. So then, for our very last box over here, 29 hundredths, we add a 100th to it. What's that going to give us? Well, if we add a 100th to 29 hundredths, that gets us to 30 hundredths, or, how do we prefer to write it? 3/10. Excellent. Now, as you know from one of our previous lessons, when we deal with equivalent fractions, 3/10 and 30 hundredths are equivalent to one another. So if you wrote it as 30 hundredths for that, I would not mark you wrong because that's an equivalent fraction. So it does work out. It's just typically we want to take and reduce it if we can. But I will not mark you wrong if you don't do that, okay? All right, one last example. Let me just spin this board real quick. Maybe. Okay. So in this decimal number chart, what are the patterns in the diagonals? So we looked at what the pattern was for the row and for the column, but we never looked at what going between diagonals looks like. So first let's fill out our chart, then we can kind of look at the patterns. So we know in a row going across, going to the right, we're going to add by what now? What was it again? 100th. So we're going to add by 100th. So we're going to get 56 hundredths. Now, what do we do when we're going in the columns? Is that 100th as well? No, it's 1/10. Remember, columns you go up by a 10th. So plus 1/10. So if we add 1/10 to 55 hundredths, we're going to get to 65 hundredths. If we add a 10th to that, then we get 75 hundredths. Another 10th will give us 85 hundredths. And one more will get us the 95 hundredths. Now we look at the second column. So add a 10th to our 56 hundredths. We get 66 hundredths. Add a 10th to 66. And we get 76. Add a 10th to 76, and we get 86. And add a 10th to 86, and we get 96. So remember, down the columns we add a 10th, across the rows, going to the right, we add a 100th. Now, let's look at these diagonals. So going from 55 hundredths to 66 hundredths, what happened? We went up by how much? 11 hundredths. So from 55 hundredths to 66 hundredths, we went up 11 hundredths. So there's a pattern. So if we start from this one, so 65 hundredths going, so starting from up to down, we end up up to down, we end up with going up 11 hundredths. So the same is going to be true here and then here as well. So that is the pattern that we're seeing there. Now if we look the other direction, then it's only 9 hundredths in each case. So going from, so this was from left to right, from right to left, we go up. Oops, that's supposed to be 9 hundredths, not 9 tenths. 9 hundredths. So that is our pattern there. So depending which direction you're going in your diagonal is going to affect how much you go up by. So if you're starting on the left-hand side and going diagonally to the right-hand side, then you're going to go up 11. But if you start from the left-hand side, or sorry, the right-hand side and go to the left-hand side, then you're going to only be going up 9 hundredths. Okay? All right, so your keyword for this lesson is pattern. I know I forgot to mention it earlier, so you'd have it multiple times, but your keyword for this lesson is pattern. Doing math is all about finding patterns and using patterns to help you as we take and go through these things. So this was, looking at simple, how do we get from one number to the next patterns? You're going to see more patterns as you grow in mathematics, and we'll get into more complicated patterns eventually. But for right now, it's these kind of patterns, nice and simple, just looking at decimal charts. So for your homework, you're going to have some decimal charts. You're going to have to fill in those missing ones. Be super, super, super careful. Sometimes on those charts that you'll see on your homework, they might have 3 columns, but maybe the middle ones aren't all necessarily there. It still counts as a space when you move to the next one, so be very careful. All right, remember your keyword for this lesson is pattern. Have an excellent day.